Hey guys, first day of class. Let's continue on with Intro to Forensic Science. So I was looking on YouTube and watching some CSI videos to see if I could find what I was looking for, and I found something that kind of illustrates the next point as we head into our next chunk of lecture. So let me show you this. Okay. So this is a video called CSI Virtual Lab Tour. So it's showing you all the different sections in the lab. So I want to show you this.
Hey, the prints on the remote were all Dale Durney, the dead manager. FYI, the batteries are dead. And the prints on the Money's rubber band are Dale Durney and Harry Steadwell.
Well, we know Dale pocketed it. Harry probably stashed it.
Why would he leave it there for a week?
Okay, so that's what I wanted you to see. So they were talking about fingerprints, okay, which is a typical section in the crime lab. And then you walk right down the hall and there is the autopsy suite. Okay, so that is one of the inaccuracies that is very commonly found on TV shows like CSI. So what I want to talk about next and what I want to pick up on are the disciplines that are found in a typical standalone, meaning its own building, crime lab. Okay, so if you watch CSI, you're led to believe that, oh yeah, you've got fingerprints, you've got ballistics, firearms, you've got drug chemistry, and then just down the hall, you have people doing autopsies. Okay, and that is just simply not accurate. Okay, so in a typical crime lab, such as the Iowa DCI lab, or where I used to work, the Illinois State Police, there are 6 main sections. Okay, on these next 2 slides, I'm going to describe those to you. So, but the first thing the point that I want to emphasize is that normally autopsies are done in a separate facility. If it's a large enough location, it is called the medical examiner's office. So there is the office of the state medical examiner in Ankeny. Or when I worked in Chicago, there was the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. And so that is a separate location. Okay, you may have the only discipline that normally you have in conjunction with the medical examiner where autopsies are being done is toxicology, because normally toxicology is done on blood and body fluids from people who have died. So it makes sense to have it connected to the medical examiner's office. Okay, but normally a crime lab, no autopsies, no forensic medicine being done there. Okay, so let's talk about the 6 sections that are normally found in a typical crime lab. So first is drug chemistry, and drug chemistry is normally the largest section that employs the biggest number of forensic scientists, simply because there's a lot of drug cases out there. And so what these people do, they have chemistry degrees, and they will identify evidence that is submitted to the lab that is thought to be illegal drugs. Everything from marijuana, if that is illegal in that particular state, to methamphetamine, heroin, something in a manufacturing setting like a meth lab, to a baggie of white powder that is found in someone's car during a traffic stop. So they look at tablets, powders, pills, and will identify what drug is present and then how much of it is there. Okay, so that's what drug chemistry does. Biology, DNA, that's the section that I worked in. And so kind of what we're used to seeing stuff that is always kind of yucky. Drug chemists don't see a lot of really icky stuff, meaning that it's covered in blood and body fluids. It tends to be just baggies of, drugs or, something that's not covered in yucky fluids, basically. But in biology, DNA, that's all we see. So the first thing that's going to happen is to try to identify the body fluid. So it can be anything from blood, semen, saliva, urine, vomit, and then take it a step further and try to identify, who could have deposited that fluid. So trying to get a DNA match with a suspect, or trying to exclude people from identifying or from have contributed to that stain. Okay, so that's what happens in the biology DNA section. Latent fingerprints, or usually just called the fingerprint section, is where you look at any type of fingerprint. Now, the term latent means invisible to the naked eye. So this is actually accurate when you see this on TV, when they are using things like super glue or fingerprint powders to try to, visualize those fingerprints. But this section will also look at prints that are what we call patent, which means you can see them. So it could be a fingerprint left in blood at a crime scene, or in ink or paint, something where you can see it with the naked eye. So if it's a fingerprint, this is the section that it's going to go to. And they can also upload those fingerprints, digitize them so that they can be searched in a database. So hopefully be able to identify unknown fingerprints and match them to either a known person or perhaps to another crime scene. Even if you don't know who the person is, you know that it is the same person because the fingerprints match. You can also do that in DNA, FYI. Okay, so those are the three of the sections. The fourth section is pattern evidence. And this is where you are looking basically at anything that can leave a distinctive, individualized pattern. So here you're looking at tool marks, like for example, something left with a crowbar. I'll show you an example of that. Tire tread, footwear, also bite marks can be considered pattern evidence. Pattern evidence is probably the best forensic evidence, along with fingerprints, because, for example, if you buy a pair of shoes, first of all, those shoes are going to have individual markings on them simply from the manufacturing process. And then when you wear those shoes, no one else is going to walk the exact same places you do. No one is going to have the exact same gait or weight distribution. So you're going to have very individualized wear and tear on the tread patterns of those shoes. Same thing with the tires on your vehicle and any kind of tool you purchase. You go to Menards and you buy a hammer. That hammer already has markings on it from the manufacturer that make it individual, and then you are going to use it basically like no other human, and so you are going to have a very individualized tool in terms of markings. So it's great in the sense that, yep, this is really individualized evidence. However, it's also one of the most controversial disciplines because there's no, long-term history of scientific experiments and math and, a long history of it being used, like there is, say, with chemistry and with, biology evidence and DNA. Pattern evidence is basically a person looking at two different patterns, one from the crime scene and one from a known sample, and then saying, yep, I think they match. Okay, so you have to rely on people being very well trained, and you could have one person who's well trained that says it's a match, another person says it isn't, and they are equally trained. So yeah, pattern evidence in theory is awesome and very individualizing. In practice, yeah, it can be very controversial. So the next section has to do with firearms, which is obviously guns. We also often use the term ballistics, though ballistics is more of an engineering term. You can also use ballistics to refer to accident reconstruction, blood spatter, but normally we associate that term with firearms. So in the firearms section, they are doing microscopic examinations of bullets, whether they are recovered from the gun of a suspect or maybe a victim during autopsy or at a crime scene. When they look at those projectiles or those bullets and also cartridge cases, they can tell what type of gun it is, okay? Is it a 9mm, for example? And just like pattern evidence in regards to tool marks, there are markings left on bullets and cartridge cases from the manufacturing process that are basically like a fingerprint to that particular weapon. So if you have a bullet that has been removed from a person at autopsy, and then you are able to get a gun from a suspect, they can fire that weapon in the ballistic section in the lab and then compare the bullets side by side to see if those striations, as we call them, and I'll show you what those are, line up. And if they match, that means that that bullet was fired from that particular weapon. Okay, so that's what ballistics does. And like fingerprints and DNA, they also have a database, so they can upload their data. So for example, you might have a bullet from a crime scene, search it in the database, and it hits to another homicide. Okay, so now you don't know whose weapon it is, but you have connected those two cases. And so detectives assigned to those cases can start working together because they know the cases are related. Whenever that happens, that's what we call an investigative lead. Okay, and then finally, section number 6 is the microscopy trace section. And these guys are the unsung heroes of the crime lab, in my opinion. They are people who basically spend all day long looking in microscopes, and they, look at anything that's tiny. So whether it's hairs, fibers, pieces of auto glass or other types of glass, gunshot residue, which is shows that a person has recently fired a weapon, soil, basically anything that you can put under a microscope. And they can tell you a lot about it. If it's vegetative matter, they can tell you, okay, this is a plant, and this is probably the species of plant. And they can also look at things side by side. So they can take a hair, maybe recovered from a victim at autopsy, and then compare it to a hair from a suspect and tell you if they could have originated from the same person. But yeah, if it's little and it goes under a microscope, these are the guys who look at it. So, very labor intensive, very detail oriented, and they don't get a lot of credit. A lot of times they are the ones that find the evidence that then goes to DNA. And then because DNA is kind of in fashion, the DNA person gets all the credit. Okay. So anyway, just want to reiterate, these are the 6 sections that make up a typical crime lab. And yes, you should know these 6 sections and know what they do. Okay, so that's a typical crime lab. But then obviously we can have other forensic disciplines, okay? And, there's so many now. If you put forensic in front of any type of science, there you go. You have a new forensic discipline, like forensic botany, okay? Looking at plants in terms of criminal or civil investigations. But here are just a couple that I want to mention, and some of these we'll be doing units on, okay? Obviously, pathology medicine, that's where autopsies are done. We'll be talking about death investigation and do a separate section. Engineering. So forensic engineers work a lot in civil cases, and they can make big bucks. They can do accident reconstruction, they can do blood spatter, and they can look at anything basically that involves any type of engineering. So let me give you an example. I don't know if you're familiar with this case, but a few years ago, there was a bridge that collapsed up in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and it was basically, a big highway. It was going across the river, and people were driving on it, just coming home from work. It was a rush hour, and all of a sudden the bridge collapsed. And people in their cars were thrown into the river. So, people died of drowning. Some people died of blunt force trauma when their vehicles, hit either the surface of the water or they were thrown elsewhere. But it was a terrible event. So you can Google, Twin Cities bridge collapse if you want to read about it. But they found that it was not an act of terrorism. There was no bomb. There was no intent to kill people. So basically the bridge failed. So you can absolutely bet that all of those victims' families, when they sued the state of Minnesota and the Department of Transportation, they hired a forensic engineer. And what those people did was they looked through all of the maintenance records for that particular bridge. How was it maintained? Did they cut corners? Why did it collapse? And so that would be an example of forensic engineering. Okay, forensic accounting is also a relatively recent discipline. So this is one of the examples of how you can certainly work and aid law enforcement and aid investigations without having to go through the police academy. So if you are an accounting major, you get your bachelor's in accounting and you pass the CPA exam, then you can take additional coursework in forensic accounting. And then once you get your certification, be put on a database. And basically work as a consultant. And so, for example, let's say at Target, maybe the, higher ups at Target discover, hey, we're seeing that some money is going missing and we think it's coming from an employee. We want to hire you to do an audit of our records and see if you can find out where that money is going and who might be responsible. And then you would do that audit and report to them, and you probably maybe would have to testify in court as to your findings. But it's a way that work as a tax accountant or whatever. And then on the side, you could go into forensic accounting and do consulting, for as much as you want to do, basically. Okay, toxicology is similar to drug chemistry in that they use a lot of the same techniques and a lot of the same instrumentation, but toxicology is looking for poisons and drugs and substances in blood and body fluids. And most of the time it's done on people who have died. So they are the ones that will identify if a person died of a drug overdose. They can also do samples on people who are alive. For example, if they take a blood sample from someone who's thought to be driving under the influence of alcohol, they can do that type of testing as well. So toxicology tends to be a little more complex, and it's simply because they're dealing with very complex body fluids, and they're dealing with substances that have been metabolized within the human body. So it's not just saying, okay, we're going to do a test for heroin. They can't look for just heroin. They have to look for the metabolites of heroin. And body fluids can be very mixed, difficult samples to isolate compounds from, so it tends to take a little longer. So that's why when you hear about deaths, especially celebrity deaths, so think of Prince, Whitney Houston, they do the toxicology results, they do the autopsy results, and then they'll say, results pending toxicology, and sometimes it can take up to 6 weeks, and it's simply because it's harder to isolate those substances from very complicated body fluids. But that is the one section that is normally associated with the medical examiner or with the forensic pathology section. Okay, entomology means looking at insects on deceased people or other types of arthropods, which means basically it can include insects, but it can also include things that are in water or an aquatic environment. Think of like lobsters and shrimp. And that can help establish a time since death when you look at those types of species. Anthropology is looking at bones. So think of skeletonized remains to try to figure out who that person is and how long they have been deceased. And then odontology is another term for forensic dentistry. So think of when someone has been badly burned in a fire and they have to use dental records to identify them. That's an example of when that would be used. So we will do a separate unit on those three, and I do them all together in one unit because those specialists tend to work together, because what ties them together is they are dealing with human remains that can't be visually identified. Okay, normally they are people who are very decomposed or skeletonized or burned or fragmented, like think of a high-speed plane crash or a bombing. So they tend to work together. Okay, psychiatry does not mean profiling. A forensic psychologist or psychiatrist normally works with people who are inmates to determine if they are competent to stand trial. They can also work cases like, for example, if you have a child who is saying that he or she is being sexually molested, and sometimes you see this when there's a bitter custody battle. So, is that one parent trying to plant that story in the child's head, or were they actually molested by a parent? So a forensic psychologist and psychiatrist can work with that child and interview them. And of course, they deal with inmates and people who are defendants to diagnose what their mental condition is. Is it a personality disorder? Is it some other type of mental illness? So that's typically what they do. Okay, microbial forensics is kind of near and dear to my heart because it combines microbiology, which is another course that I teach, with forensics. So you can actually look at the bacteria and other microbiology species, for example, on drug evidence, and that can help you determine the country of origin, where it came from, because different species live in different climates and different countries. Also, if you, and I know you guys probably either, weren't alive or were barely alive when 9/11 happened, there was a case right after 9/11 where someone sent a package containing anthrax spores to a federal building in New York, okay? And anthrax is a disease that it's not active anymore. It's just basically kept in a freezer in the National Institutes of Health and in the CDC at Atlanta for research. But somehow those spores were sent to this federal building, and thankfully no one got anthrax, okay? But the building had to be completely sterilized, and microbial forensic scientists were able to take those spores and determine where they had come from, and they were traced back to a scientist at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, who had basically become very disgruntled with the government and with his job. And yes, it was traced back to him. Okay, so they can tell a lot just looking at the bacteria, fungi, or viruses. Also, they are actively working against germ warfare, which is something we worry about in terms of terrorism. Okay, computer forensics. So this is another example of how you don't have to be a police officer, okay? But you can certainly aid law enforcement by being really good at IT, okay, or majoring in computer science. And there's a couple of different ways that you can go. First of all, identity theft, a huge problem, trying to get someone's password for their bank account and trying to skim money. That is one example, so preventing theft. Also, terrorism, okay? So if terrorists really want to attack a city, how about making, the city of New York go completely into a blackout, okay? Knocking out all the infrastructure, or knocking out all of the air traffic controllers' computers at LAX during peak takeoff and landing time. Okay, so, we need really good people on IT to try to battle terrorism in terms of knocking down computer infrastructure. Also, of course, the distribution and production of child pornography. And I'm telling you, the people who do that kind of stuff, because there's demand for it, they make a lot of money, and they are very smart and very sophisticated in how those files are transmitted and how they are hidden. And so we need people who are really smart on the good guys side, which is not as lucrative, but you're also not victimizing children. You're fighting against pedophiles. Okay, so that is another new branch of forensics. And then also, forensic nursing is a newer discipline. So this would be a person, let's say they go through the nursing program at Kirkwood and they get their RN, so they're a registered nurse, and then they can go through additional courses and training to get certified in one of 3 areas in terms of forensic nursing. They can deal with victims of domestic violence and child abuse, and also be a death investigator, so work for the local medical examiner. And then also they can become what is called a SANE nurse, which is SANE, which stands for sexual assault nurse examiner. And those are nurses that are trained in basically, if you have a victim that comes into the emergency room and they say, I've been sexually assaulted, they are assigned a SANE nurse within an hour. Okay, so the victim has to wait no more than an hour in the emergency room. And the SANE nurse is trained not only in how to collect sexual assault evidence, because that can be a very traumatic and invasive exam, but how to package the evidence so that it can be worked by the crime lab. They are also trained in the psychological trauma of sexual assault, so they are able to assess that with the victim, and then they can also be a direct interface with law enforcement in terms of testifying in court and transferring, both collecting and transferring sexual assault evidence. So they're basically linking the victim in a medical way directly with law enforcement, and being able to take care of not only their medical needs, but also evidence collection, and also, the devastating psychological trauma that can happen when a victim is sexually assaulted. Okay, so next, we are going to head into the history of forensic science. So I'm going to get this video uploaded. I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up here. Okay, thank you.